It was a cataclysmic collision between Apollo and Dionysus, between absolute reason and wild madness. At the epicenter of that collision was Paul Rothchild. He was no long-haired hippie. He was an intellectual, a devotee of classical perfection. But fate had placed the most untamed monsters of the 60s in his hands. His mission? To turn Jim Morrison's screams into art, Janis Joplin's pain into masterpieces. He was the pressure valve for a boomer generation. But what was the price of harnessing wild beasts? When the tamer became obsessed with his own beasts, he went mad. Yet to understand how the tamer eventually lost control, we must trace the thread back to a surprisingly refined beginning, far removed from the jungle he would later inhabit. The foundation of the Rothchild mystique begins in Brooklyn, New York, on April 18, 1935. But the landscape of his soul was shaped in Teaneck, New Jersey. It was here that Paul was raised, not in the gritty poverty that birthed so many rock stars, but in a home vibrating with culture and expectation. His mother was a professional opera singer. This single fact is the skeleton key to unlocking Paul Rothchild's entire career. In the 1930s and 40s, opera was the pinnacle of vocal achievement. It was a discipline that required athletes' lungs and a mathematician's brain. Growing up, Paul didn't just hear music, he inhaled it. He watched his mother practice scales, witnessing the sheer physical effort required to project a voice to the back of a hall without a microphone. He learned early on that great art wasn't an accident. It wasn't about feeling the vibe, it was about control, it was about breath, it was about knowing exactly when to push and when to pull back. While other children of his generation were listening to the simple, bouncing rhythms of radio pop, Paul was dissecting the complex emotional architecture of Puccini and Verdi. He learned that a song is a narrative, a journey with a beginning, a middle, and a cathartic end. He learned that silence is just as loud as a cymbal crash if used correctly. This upbringing instilled in him a profound sense of sonic snobbery, a belief that there was a right way and a wrong way to make sound. It gave him an almost arrogant confidence in his own ears. By the time he reached adulthood, he wasn't looking to join a band and smash guitars. He wanted to control the orchestra. He studied classical conducting. Picture a young Paul Rothchild, baton in hand, standing before an imaginary ensemble. The conductor does not make a sound, he shapes the sound of others. He is the ultimate authority, the filter through which the collective chaotic energy of 50 musicians is focused into a single, unified beam. This was the role he was born for. He was a man of structure in a world that was about to lose its mind. But the 1950s were ending, and the tectonic plates of culture were shifting. The classical world, for all its beauty, felt like a museum. It was the past. Paul was a young man with a hungry mind, and he could feel the tremors of something new rising from the underground. It wasn't rock and roll, not yet. It was something more intellectual, more rooted in history, yet vibrating with a quiet rebellion. It was the folk revival. By the early 1960s, Paul Rothchild had migrated to Boston, specifically Cambridge. This was not the chaotic, drug-fueled scene of Haight-Ashbury that would emerge later. Cambridge in 1960 was a place of tweed jackets, pipe smoke, and intense intellectualism. It was the home of Harvard and MIT, and the folk scene that bubbled up in the coffee houses around Harvard Square was serious business. Here, young men and women were trading their electric guitars for acoustic ones, digging into the archives of the Library of Congress, and resurrecting the ghosts of American history. They were singing songs about dust bowls, unions, and murders. It was music with dirt under its fingernails, but it was being performed by kids with degrees. Rothchild fit into this world perfectly. He was articulate, educated, and possessed a commanding presence. He wasn't a hippie. He was a hipster in the original sense of the word, someone in the know. He began working at a record distribution company, but his ambition couldn't be contained by sales figures. He wanted to capture the sound he was hearing in the clubs like Club 47. He didn't wait for permission. He founded his own label, Mount Auburn Records. It was a tiny operation, run on passion and shoestrings, but it was his laboratory. This is where the conductor learned to use a microphone. He realized that recording folk music presented a unique challenge. There were no electric amps to hide behind. There were no drum kits to drive the rhythm. There was just a voice and a guitar. Every breath, every squeak of a finger on a fretboard, every shift in the room's atmosphere was audible. Rothchild developed a technique of audio verite. He wanted the listener to feel like they were sitting in the front row of the coffee house, coffee in hand, cigarette smoke stinging their eyes. He learned how to place microphones to capture the air around the artist. He learned that the silence between the notes was where the emotion lived. He was applying his classical mother's lessons on dynamics to the scruffy world of folk music. He was treating dusty ballads with the reverence of an aria. It was during this time that he crossed paths with a man who would become his mentor, his boss, and his partner in revolution, Jack Holtzman. Jack Holtzman was the founder of Elektra Records. In the early 60s, Elektra was the gold standard for independent labels. Holtzman wasn't interested in churning out disposable pop hits for teenagers. He was building a library of high-quality, culturally significant recordings. He was a man of immense taste and integrity, and he was looking for a lieutenant. He found him in a record store in Boston. Rothchild was working as a salesman, but he was selling more than vinyl. He was selling the idea of the music. Holtzman watched him. He saw a man who could talk to a truck driver about country music and a professor about jazz. He saw a man with an encyclopedic knowledge and a relentless drive. Holtzman hired him on the spot. In 1963, Paul Rothchild joined Elektra Records as a house producer. It was a title that sounds bureaucratic today, but back then, it meant he was the artistic director of a revolution. He moved to New York, the epicenter of the industry. The relationship between Holtzman and Rothchild was symbiotic. Holtzman was the visionary, the man with the checkbook and the gut instinct. Rothchild was the architect, the man who knew how to build the vision. Holtzman would say, "I found this interesting folk singer," and Rothchild would take that singer into the studio and sculpt a masterpiece. His early work at Elektra was prolific. He produced albums for Tom Paxton, Phil Ochs, and Judy Collins. These were the titans of the folk movement. Rothchild's production on these records is often overlooked, but if you listen closely, you hear the precision. He wasn't just turning on the tape machine. He was coaching the artists. He was arranging the songs. He was using his classical background to suggest a cello here, a flute there, elevating simple protest songs into chamber pop. He was building a reputation as a fixer. If an artist had a great voice but no discipline, send them to Rothchild. He would drill them. He would make them do 30 takes until it was perfect. He was earning a nickname among the musicians, a taskmaster, a perfectionist, a man who heard things no one else could hear. He was demanding, yes, but the results were undeniable. The records sounded pristine. They sounded expensive. They sounded important. But folk music, for all its intellectual weight, was beginning to feel static. The Beatles had arrived in 1964, and the electric guitar was taking over the world. Bob Dylan plugged in at Newport in 1965, and the folk purists cried treason. But Paul Rothchild didn't cry. He leaned in. He heard the energy. He realized that the intellectual depth of folk could be married to the visceral power of rock and roll. He was looking for a vehicle to test this theory, and he found it in a harmonica player from Chicago named Paul Butterfield. If Paul Rothchild had never met the Doors, he would still be a legend for one specific achievement: the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. In the mid-60s, blues music in America was largely segregated. There was black music and there was white music, and rarely did the two meet on equal footing in the mainstream. Paul Butterfield was a white kid from Chicago who played the harmonica with the ferocity of a man possessed. He had learned at the feet of the masters, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf. He had a band that was integrated, featuring the brilliant white guitarist Mike Bloomfield and the legendary black rhythm section of Sam Lay and Jerome Arnold. When Rothchild heard them, he didn't just hear a blues band. He heard a battering ram. He heard the future. He signed them to Elektra, a label known for quiet folk singers. It was a gamble, but Rothchild was ready to get loud. He took them into the studio, but the first attempts were stiff. They couldn't capture the sweat and the danger of their live shows. Rothchild, the classical conductor, realized he had to change his approach. He couldn't just record them. He had to produce them. He had to manipulate the environment. He pushed them. He challenged Mike Bloomfield to play faster, harder. He challenged Butterfield to sing with more grit. The resulting self-titled debut album in 1965 was a shock to the system. It was loud, aggressive, and undeniably authentic. It kicked the door open for the American blues rock explosion, but it was their second album, East West, released in 1966, where Paul Rothchild truly revealed his genius and hinted at the psychedelic architecture he would later build for the Doors. The title track, East West, was a 13-minute instrumental. In 1966, pop songs were 2 minutes and 30 seconds long. A 13-minute jam was commercial suicide, but Rothchild encouraged it. He had been listening to Indian raga music, to Ravi Shankar, to the modal jazz of John Coltrane. He saw the connection between the drone of the sitar and the drone of the blues guitar. He pushed the band to stretch out. Don't just play the blues, he told them. Go somewhere else. Travel. He encouraged Bloomfield to explore Eastern scales. He managed the recording session like a seance, keeping the tape rolling as the band ventured into uncharted territory. The result was the invention of acid rock before the term even existed. East West was a hypnotic, swirling, psychedelic masterpiece that laid the blueprint for everything from the Grateful Dead to Santana. Rothchild had proven that he could take a street-level blues band and elevate them into the realm of high art. He had proven that chaos could be structured. He was now the hottest producer in the underground. He had the Midas touch. He was the man who could translate the counterculture for the mainstream. By late 1966, the center of the musical universe had shifted. New York was too cold, too rigid. The heat was in Los Angeles. The Sunset Strip was exploding. It was a neon carnival of long hair, mini skirts, and new ideas. Elektra Records opened an office on La Cienega Boulevard, and Paul Rothchild was sent west to be the king of the coast. He arrived in L.A. with a swagger. He was 31 years old, sharp-dressed, articulate, and riding high on the success of Butterfield and Love. He was looking for the next big thing, but he wasn't looking for another folk singer. He wasn't looking for a blues band. He was looking for something he couldn't quite define, something theatrical, something literary, something that matched the dark, operatic intensity he had absorbed from his mother's arias. He was looking for a band that could play the soundtrack to the end of the world. The LA scene was sunny. The Beach Boys were singing about surfing. The Mamas and the Papas were singing about California dreaming. But Rothchild sensed a shadow creeping in. He knew the 60s were getting darker. The Vietnam War was escalating. The drugs were getting harder. The innocence was fading. Jack Holtzman called him one day. "Paul," he said, "I've found a band. They're playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go. You need to see them. Rothchild was skeptical. Who are they? They're called The Doors. The name sounded pretentious. The Doors of Perception. Blake. Huxley. It sounded like art school nonsense. But Rothchild trusted Holzman. So, one humid night in the summer of 1966, Paul Rothchild walked into the Whiskey A Go-Go. The club was smelling of stale beer and cigarettes. The crowd was thin. On stage, there was a band that looked like they didn't belong together. A drummer who looked like a jazz cat. A guitarist who looked like a flamenco player. An organist who looked like a frantic college professor. And in the center, clinging to the microphone stand, was a singer in leather pants. Rothchild stood in the back, arms crossed, his producer's ears tuning out the crowd noise, focusing on the sound. The first set was a disaster. The band was sloppy. The singer was shy, turning his back to the audience. Rothchild grimaced. He thought, this is amateur hour. He was ready to leave. He was ready to tell Holzman he was wrong, but something kept him there. Maybe it was the organ sound, that strange carnival-esque Vox Continental tone that Ray Manzarek was coaxing out of the keyboard. It didn't sound like rock and roll. It sounded like a twisted version of the Bach fugues Rothchild had studied as a boy. He stayed for the second set. And that is when the shift happened. The atmosphere in the club changed. The singer, Jim Morrison, seemed to wake up. He started to improvise. He wasn't singing anymore. He was chanting. He was reciting poetry that sounded ancient and terrifying. He was summoning something. Father? Yes, son? I want to kill you. Rothchild froze. He felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a pop song. This was Greek tragedy. This was Oedipus Rex set to a bossa nova beat. It was dark. It was dangerous. It was intellectual. And it was exactly what he had been waiting for his entire life. In that smoky club, while the rest of the patrons were chatting and drinking, Paul Rothchild had a vision. He saw the architecture. He saw how he could take this raw, chaotic, terrifying performance and build a frame around it. He saw how he could use the studio to make this band sound not just like a rock group, but like a religion. He didn't know it yet, but he was looking at the instrument that would define his legacy and destroy his peace of mind. He was looking at Jim Morrison. And Jim Morrison, through the haze of the spotlight, was looking for a father. The architect had found his muse, but he had no idea that the muse was holding a match and the architect was standing in a room full of gasoline. The ink on the contract was barely dry in the summer of 1966 when the real work began. And it was work. The mythology of the Doors often suggests that they emerged fully formed from the womb of the counterculture, a perfect dark beast ready to devour the world. But Paul Rothchild knew the truth. He looked past the leather pants and the poetry and saw a band that was, in musical terms, a mess. They were erratic. They were undisciplined. They had great ideas, brilliant flashes of inspiration, but they lacked cohesion. They were a jazz drummer who wanted to swing, a guitarist who played flamenco with his fingers, a keyboardist who was trying to be both the bass player and the organist simultaneously, and a singer who didn't know a bar from a beat. Rothchild didn't see a rock band. He saw a disheveled orchestra that needed a conductor. He immediately imposed his will. This was the moment the classical conducting background moved from theory to practice. He moved the band into a rehearsal space before they even touched a recording studio. This was Rothchild's boot camp. He sat in the room with them, dissecting their songs measure by measure. He wasn't interested in their vibe. He was interested in their structure. He tightened the arrangements. He taught them about dynamics. The opera singer's son teaching the rock stars that if you play loud all the time, loud becomes boring. You have to whisper so the scream hurts more. He worked specifically on the rhythm section, locking Densmore and Manzarek into a groove that could support Morrison's erratic wanderings. He was building the foundation of a cathedral, knowing that the man who would stand at the pulpit, Morrison, was liable to set the pews on fire. By the time they entered Sunset Sound Recorders in Hollywood in August 1966, Rothchild had transformed them. But the studio was where the true alchemy would happen, and it was here that the legend of the fifth door was truly born. Sunset Sound was not a sterile laboratory, it was a bunker for creativity. Rothchild brought with him his trusted engineer, Bruce Botnick. Together, Rothchild and Botnick formed a formidable team. Botnick was the technical wizard, the man who understood the physics of the console, while Rothchild was the artistic director, the psychological handler, and the visionary. The recording of the debut album, simply titled The Doors, was a masterclass in atmosphere. In 1966, recording technology was primitive by modern standards. They were working with 4-track tape machines. This meant they had limited space to layer sounds. Every decision had to be final. There was no fixing it in the mix. You had to capture the magic in the moment. Rothchild's approach was radical. He treated the studio as an instrument in itself. He wasn't just recording a band playing in a room, he was creating a sonic landscape. Take the opening track, Break On Through. Listen to the drums. Rothchild wanted them to sound dry, punchy, aggressive, like a fist hitting a table. He spent hours positioning microphones on John Densmore's kit, seeking that bossa nova meets punk attack. He pushed Morrison to attack the vocal mic, to spit the words out. He wanted the listener to feel unsafe from the very first second. But the true test of Rothchild's genius and his ability to manage the shaman came with the album's centerpiece, the 11-minute epic, The End. The End was not a song. It was a psychodrama. It was a sprawling improvisational piece that Morrison had developed on stage at the Whiskey A Go-Go. It started as a goodbye to a girlfriend and mutated into a terrifying exploration of madness, death, and Oedipal violence. Most producers in 1966 would have laughed at the idea of putting an 11-minute raga rock poem on a debut album. It was commercial suicide. Radio stations wouldn't play it. It took up half a side of vinyl. Paul Rothchild didn't care about the radio, he cared about the art. He understood that this song was the soul of the band. But he also knew that capturing it on tape was going to be a nightmare. On stage, Morrison fed off the crowd's energy. In a sterile, brightly lit studio, the magic could easily evaporate, leaving behind a pretentious, boring dirge. So, Rothchild set the stage. He turned off all the lights in the studio. He lit a single candle in the vocal booth. He wanted to recreate the darkness of the club, the intimacy of a confessional. He told the band to play it live, all together. No overdubs, no safety net. He sat in the control room, watching through the glass as the band began the hypnotic, raga-like intro. The tape rolled. What happened next is one of the most hallowed moments in rock history. As the band fell into the trance, Rothchild became the silent navigator. He watched the needles on the mixing board, ensuring the levels didn't peak as the intensity grew. He watched Morrison, his eyes closed, swaying in the candlelight. When Morrison reached the infamous Oedipal section, the harrowing spoken word sequence where he enacts the murder of the father and the seduction of the mother, the tension in the control room was suffocating. Rothchild later recalled feeling a physical chill. He wasn't just recording a song, he was witnessing an exorcism. He realized he was capturing a man tearing his own psyche apart for the sake of art. A lesser producer might have stopped the tape. The lyrics were obscene. They were taboo. Father, I want to kill you. In 1966, you couldn't put that on a record. But Rothchild kept his hand off the stop button. He let the tape run. He knew this was the lightning. He knew this was the moment that would define the band forever. When the song crashed to its violent, chaotic climax and faded into silence, no one in the studio moved. The tape ran out. Rothchild sat in the dark control room, stunned. He turned to Bruce Botnick and whispered, "I think we got it." He didn't just get it. He had captured a ghost. He had proven that rock music could be literary, terrifying, and profoundly psychological. He had validated his own belief that he could conduct chaos. But Rothchild was not just an artist. He was a businessman. He knew that for the end to exist, the band needed a hit. They needed a Trojan horse to get into the American living room. That horse was "Light My Fire." The song, written primarily by guitarist Robbie Krieger, was a catchy jazz-inflected pop song. But in its original form, it was also 7 minutes long, with extended solos by Manzarek and Krieger. Rothchild loved the album version. It showed off their musical chops. But he knew AM radio would never play a 7-minute song. This is where Rothchild, the surgeon, came into play. After the album was recorded, he sat down with a razor blade and the master tape. He had to cut the song down to under 3 minutes for the single. This was physical editing, cutting the magnetic tape and taping it back together. One mistake, and the hit was destroyed. He meticulously excised the solos, splicing the choruses together. It was a controversial move. The band, particularly Manzarek, hated the idea of cutting their solos. They were purists. But Rothchild was pragmatic. He told them, "Do you want to be artists in a garage or do you want to be artists on the radio?" He made the cut. The single released in April 1967. It skyrocketed to #1. It made the Doors the biggest band in America. Rothchild was vindicated. He had given them their art and he had given them their fame. He had successfully balanced the highbrow and the lowbrow. He was the master of their universe. By the spring of 1967, the Doors were superstars, but stardom brought pressure. They had used their entire lifetime of material for the first album. Now they had to write a second album from scratch, while touring, while being mobbed by fans, and while Morrison's behavior was beginning to fray at the edges. This is where Paul Rothchild truly stepped into his power. For the second album, Strange Days, he demanded they return to Sunset Sound. But this time, the technology had leaped forward. They now had an 8-track recorder. To Rothchild, those 4 extra tracks were like discovering a new color. It meant he could layer, he could overdub, he could experiment. If the first album was a photograph of a band playing live, Strange Days was going to be a surrealist painting. Rothchild became obsessed with sonic innovation. He wasn't just recording instruments, he was inventing sounds. He encouraged the band to embrace the weirdness. Take the title track, Strange Days. Rothchild wanted Morrison's voice to sound alien, detached, like a transmission from a dystopian future. He didn't use a standard reverb. He and Botnick processed Jim's vocals through a Moog synthesizer, one of the first times the instrument was used in rock music. They had Jim sing, and then Manzarek played the synthesizer, modulating the vocal signal in real time. The result was that ghostly, echoing voice that opens the album. It was technological wizardry. But the peak of Rothchild's experimentalism and his conducted chaos came with the track Horse Latitudes. This wasn't a song. It was a nightmare. It was a poem Morrison had written in high school about horses being jettisoned from Spanish galleons to lighten the load, drowning in the calm seas. Rothchild looked at the poem and decided to create a sonic movie. He wanted the listener to feel the drowning. He turned the studio into a noise factory. He had the band go into the live room and scream, stomp, and throw things. He took a metal trash can and threw it down the stairs, recording the clatter. He recorded the sound of wind. Then he took all these sounds and played them back at different speeds. He manipulated the tape, creating a swirling vortex of white noise. He overlaid Morrison's screaming voice on top of it. It was avant-garde art. It was musique concrète, and it was being put on a pop record that would sell millions of copies. Rothchild was smuggling high art into the bedrooms of American teenagers. He was laughing at the rules. During this period, 1967 and early 1968, the relationship between Paul Rothchild and Jim Morrison was at its zenith. They were more than producer and artist. They were intellectual soulmates. Morrison was bored by most people. He found the rock press vapid. He found the groupies tedious, but Rothchild could keep up. They would spend hours in the studio control room long after the other band members had gone home, drinking whiskey and talking. They didn't talk about chord changes. They talked about Friedrich Nietzsche and the concept of the Übermensch. They talked about Arthur Rimbaud and the derangement of the senses. They talked about the French New Wave cinema of Godard and Truffaut. Rothchild was the father figure Jim had rejected in his own biological father. Rothchild was the cool dad. He was authoritative, brilliant, and demanding, but he also understood the rebellion. He validated Jim's belief that he was a poet, not just a pop singer. Rothchild fed Jim's intellect. He recommended books. He curated Jim's reading list. In the studio, when Jim was struggling to get a vocal take, Rothchild wouldn't say, "Sing it in tune." He would say, "Jim, think about the character in that Brecht play. Sing it like him." And Jim would understand. This bond was the glue that held the doors together. The other three members, Ray, Robbie, and John, were brilliant musicians, but they were often intimidated by Jim or frustrated by him. Rothchild was the bridge. He was the translator. He could explain Jim to the band, and the band to Jim. He was the adult in the room. And for a while it seemed like he could control the weather. But even as Strange Days was released to critical acclaim in late 1967, confirming Rothchild's genius, the shadow was growing. The chaos that Rothchild was conducting was starting to bleed out of the music and into the room. Jim's drinking was moving from recreational to occupational. In the early days, the alcohol had been a lubricant. It loosened Jim up. It helped him break on through. Rothchild, a man who enjoyed a drink himself, had tolerated it. Perhaps he even encouraged it slightly, believing it was part of the creative process. The Dionysian ideal required wine, after all. But during the Strange Days sessions, there were moments of darkness. Jim would disappear for days. He would arrive at the studio belligerent. He would destroy microphones. Rothchild handled it with his usual cool authority. He developed strategies. If Jim was too drunk, Rothchild would pretend to record, letting Jim sing himself sober, or he would simply send him home and work with the band on instrumental tracks. He became a master of scheduling, recording Jim's vocals only when he knew the singer was lucid. He was managing the decline, but he told himself it was the price of doing business with a genius. He believed he could compartmentalize the madness. He believed that as long as the record sounded good, the method didn't matter. He was building a wall around Jim, a wall made of studio magic and editing tricks designed to hide the deterioration from the public. He was making Jim sound like a god on record, even as the man was beginning to crumble in person. Rothchild was winning the battle for the music, but he was slowly losing the war for the man. The fifth door was open and something cold was starting to blow in. The year 1968 broke over America like a fever. The naive, flower-crowned optimism of the summer of love had withered, replaced by a harder, colder reality. The Vietnam War was screaming on the television sets every night. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy would soon be dead, their assassinations serving as grim mile markers for a nation spiraling into violence. And in Los Angeles, the Sunset Strip was no longer a playground. It was becoming a battleground. For Paul Rothchild, 1968 marked a profound shift in his role as the fifth door. The honeymoon phase was over. The band was no longer a hungry pack of wolves fighting for a record deal. They were the biggest rock act in America. They were icons. They were rich. And they were running on empty. The first two albums, The Doors and Strange Days, had been fueled by a backlog of songs Jim Morrison had written in notebooks on Venice Beach years earlier. They were the product of years of gestation. But the beast of the music industry is ravenous. It demands to be fed on a schedule. Elektra Records needed a third album. The fans needed a third album. But the notebooks were empty. Rothchild found himself in a precarious position. He was no longer just documenting a phenomenon. He was now required to manufacture one. The visionary was being asked to build a skyscraper without any steel. The sessions for the third album, Waiting for the Sun, began with an ambition that bordered on hubris. Rothchild, ever the classical conductor trapped in a rock producer's body, wanted a masterpiece. He didn't just want a collection of songs, he wanted an opera. Jim Morrison had arrived with a sprawling, disjointed collection of poems, lyrics, and spoken word pieces he called The Celebration of the Lizard. It was a mythological journey, a surreal narrative about a band of travelers, a lizard king, and a descent into the underworld. To the rest of the band, it was a confusing maze of words. To the record executives, it was unsellable nonsense. But to Paul Rothchild, it was the end part two. It was the chance to elevate rock music to the level of high theater. He saw it as the ultimate validation of his belief that Morrison was a serious poet, not just a teen idol in leather pants. Rothchild championed the piece. He cleared the schedule at TTG Studios in Hollywood. He told the band, "We are going to do this. We are going to record the whole thing. One side of the album, a 20-minute rock opera." The recording sessions for The Celebration of the Lizard became a legendary exercise in frustration. Rothchild tried to structure the chaos. He worked with Ray Manzarek to create musical themes for the different sections of the poem. He pushed John Densmore to find rhythms that matched the cadence of Jim's spoken word. But the magic that had happened during the end refused to strike twice. The end had been organic, a live performance captured in a bottle. The Celebration of the Lizard was a construction project. It was labored. They played it again and again. Rothchild, the perfectionist, would stop the tape. "Jim, you're losing the intensity in the third verse. Robbie, that guitar figure needs to be sharper." The struggle revealed the widening crack in the foundation. Jim Morrison was drinking heavily now. Not the loosening up drinking of 1966, but a dark, numbing consumption. He couldn't sustain the focus required for a 20-minute complex suite. He would drift in and out of time. The shaman was becoming a drunk. Rothchild tried to edit it together. He spent days in the editing suite with razor blades and tape, trying to stitch the best moments into a coherent whole. He was like a surgeon trying to revive a patient on the table. But eventually, even he had to admit defeat. The piece didn't breathe. It felt heavy. It felt like homework. In a heartbreaking decision, Rothchild scrapped the celebration. He realized that the grand opera he had envisioned was a failure. They salvaged only the musical centerpiece, a frantic, terrifying track called Not to Touch the Earth, and printed the lyrics of the poem inside the album gatefold. It was Rothchild's first major defeat as the mentor of the Doors. He had tried to force the magic to strike, and he had only gotten sparks. The failure of the celebration left a void on the album that had to be filled, and it forced Rothchild to pivot from high art to commercial survival. With the grand epic gone, the band was short on material. They dug up an old song from Jim's earliest days, a simple, catchy tune called Hello, I Love You. To the rock purist, this song was blasphemy. It was bubblegum. It sounded suspiciously like All Day and All of the Night by the Kinks. But Rothchild, ever the pragmatist, saw a hit. If he couldn't give the world a rock opera, he would give them a #1 single. But the recording of Hello, I Love You showed just how much Rothchild's role had changed. He wasn't capturing a band playing live anymore. He was building a track. He hated the sound of John Densmore's cymbals bleeding into the vocal mic. He wanted a dry, punchy, radio-friendly sound. So, he made a radical decision. He recorded the drums separately. He made Densmore play with a click track, a metronome beeping in his headphones, to ensure perfect, robotic timing. This was anathema to a jazz drummer like Densmore, who thrived on push and pull. But Rothchild was adamant. Perfect time, he insisted, radio time. He processed the guitar with a heavy fuzz. He compressed the vocals. He polished every rough edge until the song gleamed like chrome. It worked. Hello, I Love You went to #1. It kept the machine running. It kept the money flowing. But it alienated the hardcore fans who loved the darkness of the first album. And deep down, it gnawed at Rothchild too. He was a man who loved opera, yet he was becoming famous for producing bubblegum pop. He was saving the band commercially, but was he losing their soul? By late 1968, the Doors were in a crisis of identity, and Paul Rothchild was right in the center of it. The band was exhausted. The tours were becoming chaotic riots. Jim Morrison was increasingly unpredictable on stage, inciting crowds, getting arrested, pushing the boundaries of legality and sanity. But in the studio, Rothchild was trying to impose order on a world that was spinning out of control. He began to clamp down. His perfectionism, which had always been a trait, hardened into an obsession. He began to demand more takes. 20 takes, 30 takes, 50 takes. He was chasing a ghost, the ghost of the energy they had in 1966. He believed that if he just pushed them hard enough, if he just turned the screws a little tighter, he could squeeze the genius out of them again. The sessions became grueling. The fun was gone. The studio, once a sanctuary, became a workplace. Rothchild was the boss and the band were the employees. He would sit in the control room, chain-smoking, his eyes fixed on the meters, searching for a flaw. "Do it again," he would say over the talkback mic. "Robbie, you rush the bridge. Ray, the organ tone is too bright. Jim's, wake up." He was trying to compensate for Jim's decline with technical perfection. If Jim couldn't deliver the emotion, Rothchild would make sure the snare drum sounded perfect. It was a coping mechanism. It was the desperate captain trying to reinforce the hull because the ship was taking on water. This tension exploded with the fourth album, The Soft Parade. If Waiting for the Sun was a compromise, The Soft Parade was a declaration of war. Paul Rothchild decided that the Doors needed to evolve. He felt they had exhausted the four guys in a room sound. He was bored with the organ guitar drum format. He wanted to return to his roots. He wanted to be a conductor again. He proposed a radical idea: the Doors with an orchestra, brass, strings, horns. The band was split. Ray Manzarek, with his classical background, was intrigued. Robbie Krieger was open to it. But John Densmore was horrified. And Jim was increasingly detached, a ghost in his own band, willing to go along with whatever kept the machine moving while he focused on his poetry. Rothchild threw himself into the project with manic energy. He wasn't just producing a rock album, he was producing a symphonic suite. He hired the best session players in Los Angeles. He brought in jazz arrangers. The recording of the hit single, Touch Me, stands as the monument to this era and to Rothchild's hubris. It was not a rock session. It was a military operation. Rothchild filled the studio with horn players and string quartets. He stood at the podium conducting the session players. The Doors were relegated to being just another element in Rothchild's grand design. For John Densmore, it was hell. Rothchild demanded he play to a click track again to sync with the orchestra. Densmore argued, he pleaded, "The music needs to breathe, Paul." But Rothchild was unyielding. "The orchestra doesn't breathe, John. The orchestra plays in time." The arguments were legendary. Rothchild, the man who had once nurtured their unique chemistry, was now smothering it with layers of brass. He was trying to turn the Doors into Frank Sinatra, but the most grueling part was the vocals. Jim Morrison was struggling. His voice was thickening, ravaged by cigarettes and whiskey. He had lost the pure, cutting tenor of 1966. He was now a baritone, a crooner. Rothchild rode him hard. During the title track, The Soft Parade, another long suite that Rothchild stitched together, Jim's focus wandered. Rothchild would berate him. He treated Jim like a naughty schoolboy. "Come on, Jim, focus, you're drifting, do it again." There's a famous outtake from these sessions where Jim, frustrated and drunk, shouts, "You cannot petition the Lord with prayer." It was a moment of pure, unscripted fury. Rothchild kept it. He put it on the record. He knew that even in his messiest moments, Jim was magnetic. The Soft Parade took 9 months to record. It cost a fortune. It was the most expensive album Elektra had ever produced. When it was released in 1969, the critics savaged it. They called it pop. They called it sellout. They hated the horns. They hated the strings. Rothchild was stung. He had poured his heart into the arrangements. He believed he was elevating the band. But the fans didn't want elevation. They wanted the Lizard King. They wanted the danger. Rothchild had dressed the shaman in a tuxedo, and the world laughed. While Rothchild was trying to polish the sound in Hollywood, the reality of Jim Morrison was collapsing in Florida. On March 1st, 1969, the Doors played a concert at the Dinner Key Auditorium in Miami. It was a disaster. The venue was oversold. It was hot. Jim was drunk, bearded, and hostile. He didn't sing. He berated the audience. He taunted them. "You're all a bunch of idiots," he screamed. And then famously, tragically, he allegedly exposed himself. The legal fallout was immediate. Warrants were issued. Concerts were canceled. The Doors were blacklisted from radio stations across the country. The machine that Rothchild had worked so hard to build, the hit singles, the tours, the revenue, ground to a halt. For Rothchild, this was a nightmare. He was the architect of their career, and Jim had just taken a sledgehammer to the foundations. But psychologically, it was even deeper. Rothchild realized that his control was an illusion. He could conduct the orchestra, he could splice the tape, he could edit the single, but he could not control the man. The father figure had failed. The son had rebelled in the most destructive way possible. The aftermath of Miami changed the dynamic in the studio forever. The band was now a pariah. They retreated to Los Angeles, bruised and confused. They couldn't tour. They had nothing to do but record. Paul Rothchild looked at the wreckage of the Soft Parade and the disaster of Miami, and he made a calculated decision. He realized he had gone too far. The orchestra was a mistake. The overproduction was a mistake. He gathered the band and said, "Let's go back to basics. No horns, no strings, just the four of you. Let's make a blues album." This was the genesis of Morrison Hotel. It was Rothchild's attempt to ground the band again. He wanted to strip away the artifice. He wanted to capture the sweat of the roadhouse. The sessions were looser, grittier. Rothchild abandoned the click tracks. He let them play. He brought in a bass player, Ray Neapolitan, to free up Manzarek's left hand. He encouraged a rougher, dirtier sound. Roadhouse Blues is the testament to this shift. Rothchild didn't try to make it perfect. He tried to make it real. He let Jim growl. He let the guitar feedback. He captured the sound of a bar band fighting for its life. The album was a critical success. It was seen as a return to form. It proved that the Doors could still rock. Rothchild felt a sense of relief. He had steered the ship out of the storm. He had proven he wasn't just a pop producer. He could still capture the grit. But beneath the surface, the rot was spreading. By 1970, Paul Rothchild was tired. He was physically and emotionally exhausted. He had produced 5 albums for the Doors in 4 years. He had managed their egos, their drugs, their crises. He had been their producer, their manager, their therapist, and their father. And he was drinking too. The symbiosis with Morrison was becoming toxic. To deal with a drunk, Rothchild had to enter his world. The sessions were fueled by cocaine and alcohol. The clear-eyed classical conductor of 1966 was now a haggard, cynical veteran of the rock wars. He began to feel a deep resentment. He felt that he was doing all the work. He was the one staying up all night editing. He was the one caring about the quality. Jim seemed to care less and less. Jim was talking about moving to Paris, about writing poetry, about quitting music. Rothchild felt like he was dragging a corpse across the finish line. He loved Jim, he truly did, but he hated what Jim had become. He hated the waste of talent. He hated the slurring tongue, the forgotten lyrics, the lack of professional pride. The great burden of the producer is that you care more about the record than the artist does. The artist has the luxury of being a tortured genius. The producer has to deliver the product. Rothchild was bearing the weight of Elektra's expectations, the fans' expectations, and his own high standards. He looked at Jim Morrison across the vocal booth glass, and he didn't see the Greek god anymore. He saw a bloated, bearded man clutching a bottle of brandy. He saw a tragedy in real time. And as the band began to prepare for their 6th album, the album that would become L.A. Woman, Rothchild felt a cold realization settling in his chest. He realized that he had nothing left to give. The well was dry. The architect was out of blueprints. He walked into the rehearsal room in late 1970, expecting to hear magic. Instead, he heard what sounded like the end. November 1970. The air in Los Angeles was thick with smog and the fading, sour aftertaste of the 1960s. The Doors, once the dark princes of the Sunset Strip, were now a band under siege. They were legally entangled, professionally bruised, and culturally adrift. The Miami incident hung over them like a shroud. Radio stations had blacklisted them. Promoters were wary of booking them. They were a band with a glorious past and a terrifyingly uncertain future. And Paul Rothchild, the man who had steered their ship through every storm, was standing at the helm, looking at the horizon, and realizing he no longer recognized the sea. The band had gathered to rehearse for what would become their 6th studio album. But they weren't at Sunset Sound, the high-end, acoustically perfect temple where they had crafted their masterpieces. They were at the Workshop. It was a gritty 2-story building at 8512 Santa Monica Boulevard. Downstairs was their equipment storage and office. Upstairs was a rehearsal room. It was cramped. It smelled of stale beer, old carpet, and cigarette smoke. It was a clubhouse, not a cathedral. To Paul Rothchild, the Workshop represented a regression. He was a man of the studio. He loved the pristine silence of a soundproof room, the gleaming faders of a master console, the ability to control every frequency. The Workshop was messy. It was garage. And as he walked up the stairs in November 1970 to hear the new material, he carried with him a heavy heart. He was exhausted. The Morrison hotel sessions had been a grueling return to basics, but at least they had possessed a certain fire. Now he feared the fire was out. He sat on a folding chair, lighting a cigarette, his face impassive. He nodded at the band. "Okay," he said, "let's hear what you've got." The band began to play. They played a song called Love Her Madly. It was a jangly, upbeat number written by Robbie Krieger. It was catchy. It was commercial. But to Rothchild's ears, it sounded thin. It sounded like pop radio fodder. It lacked the menacing literary depth of The End or When the Music's Over. It felt safe. He didn't say much. He just nodded. What else? Then they played a song called L.A. Woman. It was a driving, chugging blues number. It had energy, certainly. It moved. But it was sloppy. Jim Morrison was singing the lyrics from a crumpled piece of paper, his voice a guttural bark. He wasn't the crooner of the Soft Parade anymore, and he certainly wasn't the tenor of 1967. He was a blues shouter now, his voice ravaged by years of chain-smoking Marlboros and drinking whiskey by the quart. Rothchild listened. He tried to find the architecture. He tried to imagine where the strings would go, where the overdubs would fit. But he couldn't see it. He saw a jam band. He saw a group of musicians playing 3 chords for 10 minutes without a destination. And then they played Riders on the Storm. To history, Riders on the Storm is a masterpiece. It is atmospheric, haunting, cinematic. It is the perfect driving song. But history hears the finished version, with the rain sound effects and the whispering vocals. Paul Rothchild heard the rehearsal demo. He heard Ray Manzarek playing a noodling, jazz-inflected electric piano line. He heard John Densmore playing a light, skittering jazz beat. He heard Jim Morrison mumbling the lyrics in a low, disinterested monotone. Something inside Paul Rothchild snapped. For 5 years, he had pushed this band to be great. He had forced them to be profound. He had edited their poetry, tuned their drums, and fought for their artistic soul. He had accepted the chaos because the output was genius. But as he sat in that dingy room listening to what he perceived as aimless, lazy noodling, he felt a wave of profound boredom. He didn't hear a masterpiece. He heard background music. He heard the sound of a band that had given up. The music stopped. The band looked at him, waiting for the verdict. They were used to him taking charge. They expected him to say, "Okay, Ray, change the bass line. John, tighten up the kick drum. Jim, rewrite the second verse." They were waiting for their ringmaster to pull out the blueprints. Instead, Paul Rothchild stood up. He looked at them with a mixture of sadness and contempt. "It sounds like cocktail jazz," he said. The phrase hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Cocktail jazz. In the lexicon of rock and roll, there is no greater insult. It implies music that is decorative, passionless, something to be ignored while you drink a martini in a hotel lounge. It implies irrelevance. "I can't do this," Rothchild continued. His voice was quiet, devoid of its usual booming authority. "I can't produce this. It's boring." The band was stunned. They tried to argue. "Paul, it's a mood piece," Ray Manzarek protested. "It's atmospheric." "It's wallpaper," Rothchild countered. "There's no hook, there's no fire. I'm sorry, guys, I'm not the right man for this record. You need someone who can just let the tape roll. I can't do that. I can't put my name on this." It was a moment of shocking professional violence. The fifth door was resigning. The father was walking out on the family. But we must analyze the psychology of this moment. Was Rothchild wrong? Musically, perhaps. L.A. Woman became a classic. But psychologically, he was reacting to something deeper than the chord changes. He was reacting to the smell of death in the room. He looked at Jim, sitting in the corner, a shadow of the leather-clad idol he once was, now hiding behind dark glasses and a heavy beard. Rothchild realized that he couldn't save him. He realized that producing this album would mean spending 6 months in a studio, watching his best friend slowly kill himself. He couldn't bear the intimacy of the decline. He couldn't bear to be the one to document the end of the greatness. Walking away was an act of arrogance, yes, But it was also an act of grief. He was mourning the Jim Morrison he used to know, the poet who wanted to kill his father, not this blues singer who wanted to drink himself into oblivion. He shook their hands. He wished them luck. And he walked out of the workshop into the bright, smoggy Los Angeles afternoon. He was free, but he was also, for the first time in 5 years, alone. The silence Rothchild left behind was terrifying. The Doors had never made a record without him. He was their security blanket. He was the one who knew how to work the console. He was the one who knew how to make them sound like the Doors. Into this vacuum stepped Bruce Botnick. Botnick had been the engineer on every Doors album. He was the quiet technician, the man who moved the microphones while Rothchild directed the play. He was younger, less imposing, less prone to philosophical speeches. When Rothchild walked out, the band looked at Botnick. "Well," Jim Morrison reportedly said, "who's going to produce us now?" Botnick looked around the room. He saw the potential that Rothchild was too burnt out to see. "I will," he said, "or rather we will. Let's produce it together." And then Botnick made a suggestion that would change the sound of the album, and perhaps history. He said, "Let's not go to Sunset Sound. Let's not go to a fancy studio. Let's record it right here, in the workshop." It was a radical idea. The workshop wasn't a studio. It wasn't soundproofed. It had no control room. But Botnick brought in a portable mixing console, the kind used for live concert recordings. He set it up upstairs. He ran cables down the staircase. He turned the rehearsal space into a makeshift studio. This decision was the anti-Rothchild move. Rothchild was about control, isolation, and perfection. Botnick was proposing a return to the garage. He was proposing that they capture the room, warts and all. For the band, and especially for Jim Morrison, this was liberation. There was no glass wall separating the singer from the band. Jim didn't have to go into a vocal booth. He grabbed a handheld microphone and stood right in the middle of the room with the musicians. He sang live. He sang with them. The irony of L.A. Woman is that it became a masterpiece because Paul Rothchild left. If Rothchild had stayed, he would have polished Riders on the Storm until it gleamed. He would have fixed the tempo. He would have overdubbed the vocals. He would have removed the cocktail jazz elements. And in doing so, he would have killed the haunting, ghostly vibe that makes the song so powerful. The album that emerged from the workshop sessions in late 1970 and early 1971 was loose, raw, and incredibly alive. It was the sound of a band having fun for the first time in years. Without the stern father figure watching over them, the boys were allowed to play in the mud. Jerry Sheff, the bass player for Elvis Presley, was brought in to play bass. His fluid, driving lines freed Manzarek to focus on rhythm. The sound was thick, swampy, and distinctly American. Jim Morrison thrived in this environment. He recorded the vocals for L.A. Woman in the bathroom of the workshop because the tiled walls gave it a natural reverb. Can you imagine Paul Rothchild, the opera singer's son, recording a lead vocal in a toilet? Never. But for this album, it was perfect. Rothchild, meanwhile, was on the outside looking in. He heard the rumors. He heard that the sessions were going well. He heard that Jim was happy. It must have been a complex knife in his heart. Every producer wants their artist to succeed, but no producer wants their artist to succeed because they left. It validated his decision to leave. They didn't need him anymore. But it also confirmed his obsolescence. The child had outgrown the parent. While the Doors were reinventing themselves in the workshop, Paul Rothchild was not idle. He had moved from one tragedy to another. In late 1970, just before the Doors split, Rothchild had taken on a new project. He was producing the final album for Janis Joplin, titled Pearl. The parallels were terrifying. Like Morrison, Janis was a generational talent. Like Morrison, She was a blues singer with a voice that could tear the paint off the walls. And like Morrison, she was deeply, fatally addicted. She was on heroin. Rothchild found himself in the same role he had just abandoned, the caretaker of a dying star. He poured his genius into Pearl. He created a sound for Janis that was warmer, more polished, and more emotional than her previous chaotic records. He gave her the structure she needed to deliver her greatest performances, like Me and Bobby McGee and Cry Baby. But the curse followed him. On October 4th, 1970, midway through the recording sessions, Janis Joplin was found dead of a heroin overdose in her hotel room at the Landmark Motor Hotel. Rothchild was the one who had to finish the album. He had to mix the tracks knowing she was gone. He had to leave the song Buried Alive in the Blues as an instrumental because Janis had died the night before she was scheduled to record the vocal. By early 1971, Paul Rothchild was a man besieged by ghosts. He had lost Janis to death. He had lost the Doors to a breakup. He was the most successful producer in Hollywood, and he was walking through a graveyard. In April 1971, L.A. Woman was released. Paul Rothchild put the needle on the record. He heard the driving chug of The Changeling. He heard the pop bounce of Love Her Madly. He heard the sprawling, dusty epic of the title track. And he heard Riders on the Storm. He heard the rain. He heard the whisper. And he realized that he had been wrong. It wasn't cocktail jazz. It was a funeral dirge. It was a goodbye letter. The boring music he had rejected was actually the perfect soundtrack for a man driving off the edge of the world. The album was a massive hit. It returned the Doors to the top of the charts. Critics who had hated the Soft Parade hailed L.A. Woman as a return to form. But Jim Morrison wasn't there to celebrate. In March 1971, just as the mixing was being finished, Jim Morrison made a decision. He was done. He was done with the leather pants. He was done with the Lizard King. He was done with the expectations. He told the band he was moving to Paris. He wanted to be a poet. He wanted to escape the character he had created. He packed his bags. He was unrecognizable now, heavy with a thick beard, looking 10 years older than his 27 years. He looked like a retired sea captain, not a rock star. Rothchild didn't stop him. How could he? He had already walked away. There were no dramatic goodbyes between the architect and the muse, just a quiet fading away. Jim got on a plane to France, chasing the ghosts of Rimbaud and Baudelaire, chasing a peace that had always eluded him in Los Angeles. Rothchild stayed in L.A., working on other projects, trying to keep busy, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of dread that had settled in his stomach. He knew Jim. He knew Jim's appetites. He knew that Paris, with its romance and its wine and its heroin, was not a rehabilitation center. It was a playground for the self-destructive. July 1971, a heat wave in Los Angeles. The phone rang in the Electra offices. It rang in the homes of Ray Manzarek and John Dinsmore, and the news began to trickle through the grapevine, confused at first, then terrifyingly specific. Jim is dead. Heart failure. Bathtub. Paris. When Paul Rothchild heard the news, he didn't weep. Not immediately. The reaction was a hollow, crushing sense of inevitability. It was the sound of the other shoe dropping. He had been waiting for this call for 5 years, ever since he first saw Jim on stage at the Whiskey A Go-Go, screaming about death. Rothchild had known that this story was a tragedy. You don't sing about the end so passionately unless you are rushing towards it. But the inevitability didn't lessen the pain. It amplified the guilt. The questions began to swirl in his mind, questions that would torture him for the rest of his life. What if I hadn't quit? If Rothchild had produced L.A. Woman, the sessions would have taken longer. He would have been harder on Jim. He would have kept Jim in Los Angeles for another month, maybe 2. Jim wouldn't have been in Paris in July. He would have been in a vocal booth in Hollywood being yelled at by Paul Rothchild. Did his resignation sign Jim's death warrant? By walking away, did he remove the last guardrail that was keeping the car on the road? Of course, this is the logic of grief. Jim Morrison was a grown man responsible for his own fate, but Paul Rothchild was a controller. He was an architect. He believed he shaped reality. And to a man like that, the death of his creation felt like a structural failure. The cathedral had collapsed, and the architect was left holding the blueprints, wondering where he had miscalculated the load-bearing walls. The king was dead. The 1960s were officially finally over, and Paul Rothchild was left alone in the control room, surrounded by silence. The summer of 1971 settled over Los Angeles like a suffocating blanket. To the outside world, the music industry was simply turning another page. The 1960s were contractually over. The Beatles had broken up. Jimi Hendrix was dead. Janis Joplin was dead. And now, Jim Morrison was dead. The four horsemen of the counterculture had been removed from the board, leaving a vacuum that the corporate machine was eager to fill with softer, safer sounds. But for Paul Rothchild, the silence was personal. It was deafening. He did not go to Paris for the funeral. Père Lachaise Cemetery, with its Gothic stones and weeping angels, was too far, too final. He stayed in Hollywood, trapped in the city where he had built the monument that had now become a tomb. He was 36 years old. He was wealthy. He was the most famous producer in America. And he was a man haunting his own life. The psychological toll of losing Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison within 9 months of each other cannot be overstated. These were not just clients. They were his children, his muses, his tormentors, and his friends. He had spent thousands of hours locked in windowless rooms with them, dissecting their psyches, pushing them to their limits, and recording their souls. He had been the adult in the room, the one responsible for the output. And now, the output was all that was left. He felt a distinct survivor's guilt. It is a common affliction among those who work behind the scenes. The producer survives because he stands on the safe side of the glass. He doesn't take the drugs. He doesn't have to be the god on stage. He goes home at night. But Rothchild wondered in the dark hours of the morning if his perfectionism had pushed them too hard. Had the pressure to create the end or crybaby contributed to the fracture? He was a conductor without an orchestra. He was an architect who had watched his two greatest cathedrals burn to the ground. And now he had to figure out how to lay bricks again. The immediate aftermath of Morrison's death presented a strange, ghostly problem. The Doors still existed. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore were still alive. They were still in their 20s. They were brilliant musicians, and they were in denial. They decided to carry on. They believed that the Doors was a democracy, a four-way split, and that the loss of one member, even the singer, shouldn't end the band. They retreated to their rehearsal space to record a new album, Other Voices. They didn't hire a new singer. Ray and Robbie shared the vocal duties. Paul Rothchild watched this from a distance with a mixture of pity and respect. He loved those three guys. He knew how talented they were, but he also knew the brutal truth of rock and roll. The Doors without Jim Morrison was like a body without a head. It could move, it could function, but it couldn't speak. The trio eventually asked Rothchild to listen to the new material. It was a painful audition. He sat in the studio listening to songs like Tightrope Ride. The musicianship was impeccable. The groove was tight. But the hole in the center of the sound was massive. Rothchild was honest with them. He told them the music was good, but it wasn't magic. He declined to produce the post-Morrison albums. He couldn't do it. To him, producing the Doors without Jim would be an act of necrophilia. It would be pretending that the ghost was still in the room. He stepped away, allowing the trio to produce themselves. Other Voices and Full Circle were released to polite applause and lackluster sales. The public agreed with Rothchild. The spell was broken. The band dissolved shortly after, and the members scattered into solo projects. The fifth door had officially closed. Paul Rothchild was now a free agent in a changing world. The music industry of the early 1970s was shifting away from the psychedelic poetic chaos of the Sunset Strip. The new sound was slicker. It was the era of the singer-songwriter and the rise of corporate arena rock. Rothchild needed to reinvent himself. He couldn't just be the Doors guy forever. He needed a project that proved he could produce a hit without a shaman. He needed to prove that his genius lay in his technique, not just his association with tragedy. He threw himself into work. He produced albums for the Lovin' Spoonful's John Sebastian. He worked with folk artist Fred Neil. These were good records, beautifully recorded, showcasing his audio verite style. But they didn't set the world on fire. They lacked the danger. Rothchild was bored. He missed the adrenaline of the 1960s. He missed the challenge of trying to tame a hurricane. He needed a band that had teeth. And in 1974, he found them in the swamps of Florida. Southern rock was exploding. The Allman Brothers Band and Lynyrd Skynyrd were dominating the airwaves with a sound that was distinct from the LA scene. It was gritty, guitar-heavy, and rooted in the blues. All things Rothchild loved, but it was also disciplined. These bands played with a ferocity and precision that appealed to his classical sensibilities. Clive Davis, the legendary executive who had just founded Arista Records, called Rothchild. "Paul," he said, "I've signed a band from Tampa. They're called the Outlaws. They've got 3 guitar players. I want you to make them stars." 3 guitar players. It sounded like a nightmare of frequencies. How do you mix 3 lead guitars without it sounding like a train wreck? But Rothchild was intrigued. He flew to Florida to see them. What he saw in the Outlaws was a raw, unpolished gem. They were a bar band, hardened by years of playing 4 sets a night in biker bars. They had stamina, they had chops. Led by the stoic, talented Huey Thomason, they played a brand of country rock that was faster and harder than the Eagles, but more melodic than Skynyrd. Rothchild signed on. He brought them to Los Angeles, but he didn't take them to the gritty workshop. He took them to the record plant. He was going to give these Florida cowboys the full Hollywood treatment. The recording of The Outlaws is one of the unsung masterpieces of Rothchild's career. It proved that his architect moniker was well earned. He applied the same rigorous discipline to the Outlaws that he had applied to the Doors. He made them tune their drums. He made them practice their vocal harmonies until they were perfect. The band, used to the loose atmosphere of the bars, was initially shocked by his intensity. Who was this guy in the expensive shirt telling them how to play guitar? But then they started recording Green Grass and High Tides. Green Grass and High Tides was the Outlaws' magnum opus. It was a sprawling 10-minute epic that built from a slow melodic ballad into a furious triple guitar crescendo. To Rothchild, this was the end all over again. It was a long-form narrative piece that required careful structuring. He realized that the 3 guitars weren't a problem. They were an orchestra. He arranged the guitars like a string section. He put Huey Thomason on the left, Billy Jones on the right, and Monte Yoho in the center. He treated the guitar solos not as jams, but as movements in a symphony. He coached them on tone. "Make the first solo sound like water," he would say. "Make the last solo sound like fire." He pushed them to their physical limits. The outro of the song is a relentless high-speed endurance test. Rothchild refused to let them splice it. He wanted the exhaustion on the tape. He wanted the sound of men playing for their lives. When the album was released, Green Grass and High Tides became a massive FM radio staple. It remains one of the most famous guitar songs in history. Rothchild had done it. He had taken a bar band and made them sound like gods. He had successfully transitioned from the psychedelic 60s to the arena rock 70s. But working with the Outlaws also highlighted what was missing. Huey Thomason was a great musician, but he wasn't Jim Morrison. There were no late-night discussions about Nietzsche. There was no danger of the singer exposing himself on stage. It was professional. It was successful. But it wasn't magic. By the mid-1970s, Paul Rothchild was 40 years old. He was a millionaire. He lived in a beautiful house in Laurel Canyon. He drove fast cars. He had a reputation as the best producer in the business. But he was suffering from a profound existential crisis. The music industry was changing. It was becoming corporate. The suits were taking over. The creative freedom of Elektra Records was gone, swallowed up by conglomerates. The art was becoming product. And Rothchild was haunted. He couldn't give an interview without being asked about Jim Morrison. What was he really like? Did he really kill himself? Is he alive in Africa? Rothchild became the keeper of the flame, but the flame burned him. He felt trapped in 1969. He wanted to be recognized for his current work, but the shadow of the Doors was so long it eclipsed everything else. He was the fifth door, a member of a band that no longer existed. He tried to find a new muse. He wanted to find a female artist who had the same emotional depth as Janis Joplin. He thought he found her in Bonnie Raitt. Bonnie Raitt was a critical darling, a blues guitarist with a smoky voice and a cult following. But she hadn't broken through to the mainstream. In 1975, Warner Brothers hired Paul Rothchild to produce her fifth album, Home Plate. This project reveals the dark side of Rothchild's perfectionism. He decided that Bonnie Raitt needed a makeover. He wanted to turn the blueswoman into a pop star. He applied his disciplined approach with a heavy hand. He brought in session musicians, the best in LA, and sidelined Bonnie's touring band. He selected songs that were polished pop numbers, steering her away from the gritty blues she excelled at. He covered her voice in gloss. The result was a disaster. Home Plate is widely considered the worst album of Bonnie Raitt's career. It sounds generic. It sounds overproduced. It sounds like a producer trying to impose his will on an artist who didn't fit the mold. The critics savaged it. Bonnie Raitt herself hated it. She felt that Rothchild had stripped away her identity. This failure hit Rothchild hard. It was a humbling moment. It proved that his system, the discipline, the polishing, the classical structure didn't work for everyone. You couldn't just build a cathedral anywhere. The ground had to be right. He realized that he had lost touch. He was trying to make records that sounded like 1968 in 1975. He was trying to manufacture magic, and the audience could hear the machinery creaking. As the late 1970s approached, Paul Rothchild retreated. He worked less. He spent more time at home. He watched as the punk rock movement exploded in 1977. Punk was the antithesis of everything Rothchild stood for. It was sloppy. It was fast. It was anti-intellectual. It was the Ramones playing 3 chords in 2 minutes. There was no architecture. There were no string sections. There was just noise. To a man who had spent his life championing high fidelity and sonic perfection, punk felt like an insult. But deep down, he recognized the energy. It was the same energy he had seen at the Whiskey A Go-Go in 1966. It was chaos. But this time, the chaos didn't want a conductor. It wanted to burn the opera house down. Rothchild felt obsolete. The dinosaur label was being thrown around for men of his generation. He was a relic of a bygone era, a man who talked about tubes and tape saturation in a world that was moving towards synthesizers and drum machines. He fell into a depression. He drank. The curse of the survivor is the feeling that you have outlived your relevance. He had survived the drugs, he had survived the lifestyle, but he was slowly dying of irrelevance. He needed a project that would reconnect him with his past, but in a way that felt new. He needed something big, something theatrical, something that required a man who knew how to handle a tragic, drug-addicted genius. Feeling alienated by the present, Rothchild found solace in a medium that thrives on fabrication. Hollywood. The master builder was back. But this time, he wasn't building for the living. He was creating a mausoleum. The late 1970s marked a strange and ghostly transition in the life of Paul Rothchild. He had spent the previous decade capturing the raw, bleeding edge of reality. He had recorded the actual screams, the real heroin-induced hazes, and the genuine disintegration of human souls. But as the 80s approached, his role shifted. He was no longer a documentarian of the present. He was becoming a curator of the past. And more dangerously, he was becoming a recreator of his own traumas for the entertainment of others. The music industry had moved on. The raw, organic sound Rothchild championed, the sound of tubes heating up, of air moving in a room, of mistakes left on tape for texture, was being replaced by the sterilized perfection of the digital age. Drum machines were replacing drummers. Synthesizers were replacing organs. The human element, which had been Rothchild's obsession, was being engineered out of the process. Feeling alienated by the present, Rothchild found solace in a medium that thrives on fabrication: Hollywood. In 1978, Paul Rothchild stepped onto the set of the film The Rose. To the casual observer, it was just another movie production. Lights, cameras, craft services tables. But to Rothchild, it was a seance. The film was a thinly veiled biography of Janis Joplin. It told the story of a self-destructive female rock star who burns bright and dies of an overdose. The lead role was played by Bette Midler, a powerhouse performer from the Broadway and cabaret world, but a woman who was decidedly not a rock and roller. She didn't have the grit. She didn't have the dirt. Rothchild's job was to give her the dirt. He was hired as the soundtrack producer, but he became something far more intense: a method acting coach for the voice. He had to teach Bette Midler how to sound like Janis Joplin. This process was psychological warfare. Rothchild had to dig into his own painful memories of the Pearl sessions. He had to remember exactly how Janis breathed, how she cracked on the high notes, how she sounded when the heroin was kicking in versus when it was wearing off. He had to take those memories and transplant them into Bette Midler. The recording of the soundtrack was grueling. Rothchild wasn't looking for a clean vocal. He was looking for the sound of a larynx being torn apart. He pushed Midler. He exhausted her. He made her sing until her voice was ragged, until the theatrical polish was stripped away, revealing a raw nerve. There is a scene in the film and a track on the album called "Stay With Me." It is a desperate, screaming plea of a song. When Midler recorded it, Rothchild was in the control room, conducting her not just musically, but emotionally. "More pain," he would urge. "Don't sing it like a star. Sing it like a junkie who's about to be left alone." For Rothchild, this was a surreal form of therapy. He was rewriting the ending. In real life, he couldn't save Janis. She died alone in a hotel room before the record was finished. But in the movie, he could control the narrative. He could make the tragedy beautiful. He could perfect the death. When The Rose was released in 1979, it was a massive success. The soundtrack went platinum. Bette Midler was nominated for an Academy Award. Paul Rothchild had proven that he could manufacture rock and roll authenticity even on a Hollywood soundstage. He had successfully conjured the ghost. But success felt different now. In the 60s, the success came from discovering something new. Now the success came from remembering something dead. He was monetizing his own grief. The triumph of the Rose gave Rothchild a second wind, but the 1980s proved to be a barren landscape for him. The decade of neon, hair metal, and synth pop was the antithesis of everything he stood for. He hated the production style of the 80s. He hated the gated reverb on the snare drums. He hated the icy precision of digital recording. To a man who treated the recording studio as a warm, wooden instrument, the new studios felt like operating theaters. He worked sporadically. He produced a few albums for artists like Bonnie Bramlett, but nothing stuck. The industry regarded him as a classic producer, a polite way of saying dinosaur. He was the guy you called if you wanted a retro sound, not if you wanted a hit. Rothchild retreated to his home in the Hollywood Hills. He became a recluse of sorts. He spent his days tending to his garden, driving his sports cars, and watching the sunset over the city he used to own. He was wealthy enough not to work, which is a dangerous thing for a workaholic. Without the structure of the studio, the silence of his house became loud. He was surrounded by gold records, The Doors, Strange Days, L.A. Woman, Pearl. They hung on the walls like hunting trophies, proof that he had once wrestled with giants. But the giants were gone. He watched from his ivory tower as the legacy of the Doors began to mutate. In the early 1980s, something strange happened. The Doors didn't fade away, they got bigger. A new generation of teenagers, bored with the synthetic pop of Duran Duran and Culture Club, discovered the dark, dangerous poetry of Jim Morrison. A biography titled No One Here Gets Out Alive, written by Danny Sugerman and Jerry Hopkins, became a bestseller. It painted Morrison not just as a singer, but as a mythical figure, a god of excess, a rebel philosopher. Rolling Stone magazine put Jim Morrison on the cover with the headline, "He's hot, he's sexy, he's dead." Suddenly, Paul Rothchild was in demand again, not as a producer of new music, but as an oracle. Journalists came to his house to ask about the real Jim. Filmmakers wanted to license the music. The back catalog was selling millions of copies a year. Rothchild found himself in the position of legacy manager. He was tasked with remastering the old albums for the new CD format. This process was technically fascinating, but emotionally harrowing. Rothchild had to go back into the vault. He had to pull out the master tapes from 1967 and 1968. He had to sit in a studio alone and listen to the raw tracks. He heard the studio chatter. He heard Jim laughing before a take. He heard the false starts. He heard the sound of a lighter clicking as Jim lit a cigarette. For the fans, these were just sounds. For Rothchild, they were ghosts. He was sitting in a room with his dead friends, hearing them breathe. He was 50 years old, listening to himself at 30, listening to the optimism, the energy, the belief that they were changing the world. He remastered the albums with obsessive care. He hated the early digital transfers. He felt they sounded brittle. He fought to preserve the warmth of the analog tape. He was the guardian of the sonic truth. He wanted the kids buying the CDs in 1985 to hear exactly what he heard in Sunset Sound in 1967. He was polishing the monuments, keeping the inscriptions legible for the next generation. Then, in 1990, the ultimate opportunity and the ultimate conflict arrived. Hollywood finally decided to make the definitive biopic, The Doors. The director was Oliver Stone, a man known for his aggressive, conspiratorial, and heavy-handed style. Stone didn't want to make a polite musical biography. He wanted to make a fever dream. He wanted to capture the shamanic madness of the 60s. Paul Rothchild was hired as the musical producer and technical consultant. This was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a massive paycheck and a chance to ensure the music was treated with respect. On the other hand, it meant handing over his life story to Oliver Stone, a man who famously prioritized myth over fact. The production of the movie The Doors became the final great struggle of Paul Rothchild's professional life. From day one, there was friction. Oliver Stone viewed Jim Morrison as a wild, drunk, out-of-control Dionysian figure. He focused on the excess, the addiction, the violence. Rothchild, the man who had actually lived it, argued for balance. He tried to tell Stone about the quiet Jim, the shy poet, the intellectual who read philosophy. Jim wasn't a drunk buffoon, Rothchild would argue. He was the smartest man in the room. But Stone wasn't interested in the smart man. He was interested in the Lizard King. Rothchild realized with a sinking heart that the movie was going to solidify the very myth that had killed Jim. It was going to celebrate the destruction. However, Rothchild had a job to do, and that job was to make Val Kilmer sound like Jim Morrison. Val Kilmer's performance in The Doors is legendary. He looks like Jim, moves like Jim, and, miraculously, sounds like Jim. But that sound was not an accident. It was a feat of engineering by Paul Rothchild. Rothchild took Val Kilmer into the studio months before filming began. He treated Kilmer exactly the way he had treated Jim in 1966. He put him through vocal boot camp. He taught Kilmer how Jim breathed. He taught him how Jim slurred his words when he was drunk versus when he was reciting poetry. He broke down the phrasing of every song. Jim was a crooner here, he would say. He was a blues shouter there. But the real magic happened in the mixing room. Rothchild did something revolutionary. He realized that while Kilmer could sing, he lacked the deep, resonant baritone of Morrison. So, Rothchild created a Frankenstein vocal. He took the original master tapes of The Doors. He isolated Jim's voice. Then he recorded Kilmer singing the same lines. In the final mix, he blended them. When Kilmer was singing quietly, it was mostly Kilmer. When the song exploded into a scream, Rothchild would fade up the real Jim Morrison. He wove the two voices together so seamlessly that even the surviving band members couldn't tell the difference. It was his final masterpiece of production. He had brought Jim Morrison back to life using a living actor as the vessel. It was a technical triumph, but a psychological ordeal. Rothchild was spending his days directing a man who was dressed like his dead friend, acting out the worst moments of their shared past. He was recreating the Miami concert. He was recreating the drunken fights. He was stuck in a time loop, directing a reenactment of his own trauma. In a moment of supreme irony, Oliver Stone asked Rothchild to make a cameo in the film. He cast Rothchild not as himself, but as the manager of the London Fog, the seedy club where the Doors first started. There is a scene where the manager fires the band. He tells them they are terrible, that they have no future. Paul Rothchild, the man who believed in the Doors more than anyone, stood on a movie set and delivered the line, "You guys suck." It was a metafictional joke, a wink at the audience, but it also symbolized the surreal nature of his existence. He was now a character in his own life story, playing a villain in the mythology he had helped create. The filming wrapped in 1990. The movie was a box office hit, though it divided fans and infuriated the surviving band members who felt it caricatured them. But the soundtrack, produced by Rothchild, was a smash. A new generation bought the best of albums. The Doors were bigger than ever. Paul Rothchild had done it again. He had successfully shepherded the legacy into a new decade. He was 55 years old. He should have been taking a victory lap. But during the production of the film, he had developed a persistent cough. He ignored it at first. He was a smoker. Everyone in the 60s was a smoker. The studio air had been thick with blue smoke for 30 years. It was an occupational hazard, but the cough didn't go away. It got deeper. It became a rattle in his chest. In late 1990, he went to a doctor in Los Angeles. He sat in the sterile examination room, the paper gown crinkling as he shifted. The doctor came in with an X-ray. He put it up on the light box. There, in the ghostly gray landscape of Paul Rothchild's lungs, was a shadow. It was cancer. Stage 4. The diagnosis was not a surprise, not really. It was the bill coming due. Paul Rothchild had spent his life inhaling the atmosphere of rock and roll. He had breathed in the smoke of the jazz clubs, the smoke of the hash pipes, the smoke of the Marlboros that fueled the LA Woman sessions. He had literally consumed the environment he created. He had built a monument of sound, but the materials were toxic. Paul Rothchild's reaction to his diagnosis was typical of the man. He treated it like a production problem. It was a technical glitch that needed to be managed. He didn't fall apart. He didn't rail against God. He applied his classical discipline to his illness. He researched treatments. He organized his schedule. He approached chemotherapy with the same stoicism he had approached a grueling 24-hour recording session. He kept working. He was determined to finish his work on the Doors' legacy. He wanted to ensure that the master tapes were archived correctly. He wanted to leave everything in perfect order. But the cancer was aggressive. It moved with the speed of a punk song, not a symphony. As his body weakened, his mind remained sharp. He spent his final years reflecting on the journey. He sat in his home in the Hollywood Hills, looking out over the sprawling grid of Los Angeles, the city of dreams, the city where he had found a shaggy group of musicians and turned them into icons. He thought about the dark pattern, the idea that he was the fifth door, destined to follow the others into the dark. Jim was gone. Janis was gone. And now the man who had recorded their goodbyes was preparing to say his own. He realized, perhaps, that this fate wasn't supernatural. It was simply the intensity of the life they had chosen. They had tried to break on through to the other side. They had tried to touch the sun. And when you touch the sun, you burn. Jim and Janis had burned fast, exploding like supernovas. Rothchild had burned slow, like a candle in a vocal booth, steady and unwavering, until the wax was finally gone. By 1994, it was clear that the treatment wasn't working. The Titan was crumbling. He began to say his goodbyes. He spoke to Ray Manzarek. He spoke to Robbie Krieger and John Densmore. The old tensions, the arguments about cocktail jazz, the friction of the lawsuits, it all faded away. What remained was the shared history. They were the only ones who remembered the magic of the room. They were the only ones who knew what it felt like when the red light went on and the tape started rolling. Rothchild wasn't afraid of death. He had spent his career making art out of death. He had produced The End. He had produced Crybaby. He knew that the end of the song is what gives it meaning. He spent his final days listening to music, not rock and roll. He went back to the beginning. He listened to opera. He listened to the classical symphonies his mother had taught him. He listened to the perfect, ordered structures of Bach and Beethoven. He found comfort in the order. The chaos of his life, the screaming fans, the drug overdoses, the lawsuits, the movie sets, was fading into silence. And in that silence, he finally heard the perfect harmony he had been chasing his entire life. The faders were coming down. The tape was running out. The session was ending. March 1995. The view from the Hollywood Hills was spectacular. Below, the sprawling grid of Los Angeles shimmered in the heat haze, a city of dreams, of broken promises, of neon and noir. Paul Rothchild sat in his home, looking out at the empire he had helped soundtrack. His body, once the energetic vessel of a man who could out-talk, out-drink, and outwork the wildest rock stars on the planet, was now frail. The cancer had done its work with efficient cruelty. The breathing that had been the obsession of his life, the breath control of the opera singer, the gasping breath of Janis Joplin, the shamanic exhalations of Jim Morrison, was now a struggle for the man himself. He was 59 years old. In the timeline of a regular life, he was barely past middle age. But in the timeline of rock and roll, he was an ancient. He had lived through the birth, the explosion, and the death of the counterculture. He had survived the storms that had swallowed his friends. He was the last man standing from the inner circle of the tragic geniuses. As the end approached, the house in the hills became a place of pilgrimage and quiet reflection. The noise of the industry faded. The lawsuits, the gold records, the arguments over royalties. It all seemed trivial now. What remained were the relationships. One of the most poignant aspects of Rothschild's final months was the reconciliation with the surviving members of the Doors. For decades, their relationship had been complex, layered with the scar tissue of the LA Woman sessions. The cocktail jazz comment had been a jagged stone in their collective shoe. But death has a way of softening the edges of history. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore knew that without Paul Rothchild, they might have remained a quirky bar band at the London Fog. They knew that he was the one who had taught them how to be recording artists. He was the one who had turned their jams into symphonies. They visited him. The conversations were no longer about business. They talked about the old days. They talked about the magic of the studio, the feeling of the red light turning on, the smell of the tape, the electricity in the air when Jim walked up to the mic. In these final conversations, there was a tacit understanding. Rothschild's departure in 1970 wasn't an act of betrayal. It was an act of necessity. He had left to save himself, and in doing so, he had forced them to grow up. They realized that L.A. Woman was a masterpiece not in spite of him, but because of the discipline he had instilled in them for the 5 years prior. He had built the engine so well that it could run for one last lap without him. The fifth door was acknowledged one last time. He wasn't just a producer. He was the older brother, the mentor, the difficult, brilliant, demanding genius who had loved them enough to push them to the edge of sanity. On March 30th, 1995, the faders finally came down. Paul Rothchild passed away in his sleep. There was no chaotic scene. There was no overdose in a bathtub. There was no mysterious disappearance in Paris. It was a quiet, human end to a superhuman career. The architect laid down his tools. The news rippled through the music world. To the casual fan, it was a footnote. Producer of The Doors dies. But to the insiders, to the musicians, engineers, and historians, it was the end of an era. The man who had captured the storm of the 1960s was gone. His funeral was not a media circus. It was a gathering of the tribe. The survivors of the Sunset Strip came to pay their respects. They weren't mourning a celebrity. They were mourning a witness. Paul Rothchild was the man who had seen them at their most vulnerable. He was the keeper of their secrets. As they lowered him into the ground, the question hung in the air. Was he a tyrant who imposed his will, or a genius who elevated chaos into art? The answer lies in his unique philosophy. Paul Rothchild was the bridge between two worlds, standing with one foot in the disciplined structure of opera and the other in the drug-fueled rebellion of the 1960s. Without him, the Doors might have been a messy footnote. Instead, he gave them sonic cinema. Think of The End. It isn't just a song, but a Greek tragedy recorded on magnetic tape. Rothchild didn't just record the band, he built a structural theater for Jim Morrison's madness to perform in. His legacy is equally defined by the women he recorded, specifically Janis Joplin. He possessed an uncanny ability to capture the sound of a breaking heart, perhaps stemming from his understanding of operatic tragedy. With Janis Joplin's Pearl, he managed the impossible, taking a woman who was physically disintegrating and giving her dignity. He created a musical safety net that allowed her to take her final desperate leap. He didn't exploit her pain. He consecrated it, ensuring that her suffering would transform into art that comforts millions. Yet, we cannot ignore the heavy toll of standing so close to the fire. Rothchild became the designated survivor, trapped in the amber of the 1960s, forever answering for the friends he couldn't save. There's a profound loneliness in this role. To be the master builder means you construct the house, but you never get to live in it. The house belongs to the star, while the builder stands outside, knowing every beam and nail, yet remaining a stranger to the glory. In the final analysis, Paul Rothchild was a perfectionist in an imperfect world, a man of order in a time of chaos. His greatest achievement was proving that a pop song could contain the entire universe of human emotion, love, death, fear, and transcendence, if framed correctly. Today, when a teenager puts on headphones and hears the rain in Riders on the Storm, they are hearing the atmosphere Rothchild conjured. Jim Morrison provided the lightning, but Paul Rothchild provided the thunder. Paul Rothchild is gone, but the cathedral of sound he built still stands against the skyline of history. It remains a monument to the beautiful, terrifying era when rock and roll tried to touch the face of God. Inside that cathedral, the music never stops. The ghost is still singing, and behind the glass in the shadows, the architect is still listening, nodding his head, waiting for the perfect take.